All right, we're back and we're chatting about personality traits. So, what is personality? Personality refers to the characteristic ways that people differ from one another. We can best understand these differences by talking about something called personality traits, and these traits are basic dimensions on which people differ. There's a limited number of these dimensions, and each individual can be either low, medium, or high on any trait. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that personality traits reflect a continuous distribution. So it's not just that you have a distinct personality type if you are, for example, a little bit more extroverted as compared to introverted. So, for example, introverts and extroverts as people are not qualitatively different people, but those who score high or low along this continuous distribution. Most people fall somewhere in the middle, and there's with smaller numbers kind of showing more extreme levels. So, for example, if we're looking at this image, this is the image of the distribution of scores measuring extroversion from thousands of different people. So as you can see, with most things in psychology, we've got that beautiful bell curve with the majority of people falling somewhere kind of in that medium to medium higher side of things, and significantly less people to either side of the tail of the curve. Well, if we're going to be talking about personality traits, there's a couple criteria that's important for us to have in order for it truly to be a personality trait. So, for example, if it is truly a personality trait, there has to be consistency. So, this trait has to be consistent across situations. Okay, the characteristics should also be stable over time. And what we should see is that people differ from one another on behaviors that are related to the particular trait in question. So the trait approach has been kind of the dominant approach to personality theory over the last 30, 40 years for sure. But even before that, what we've been trying to do is to systematically reduce the number of traits so that we can discover the basic traits that best describe the differences between most people. So Allport and Odbert, back in 36, they searched the dictionary for all the descriptors of personality, and so they were guided by a lexical hypothesis. And so their hypothesis was that important personality characteristics should be reflected in the language that we use to describe other people. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And so they came up, though, with this system using a list of about 4,500 descriptive terms. Now, my goodness, that is a very, very nuanced look at personality if all 4,500 of those descriptive terms meaningfully differentiate between different people. Well, thankfully, some statistical techniques came along, in particular factor analysis, which we briefly talked about in the preceding video. But Cattell and others determined that there's a smaller number of meaningful dimensions. So the most widely accepted system, the one that we currently use, is what we call the Big Five, or the five-factor model, the FFM. You can also call it by its acronym, so either ocean or canoe, and I'll explain why in a minute. You can call it that. And what we found, or what researchers have found, is that scores on the Big Five traits are mostly independent. So thus, all five scores are needed to have a fuller picture of a person's trait. So whereas the MBTI, for example, would say that extroversion and introversion are kind of one dimension, or sensory sensation and perception, Big Five is saying that we've got all five factors in differentiating amounts, and that is what meaningfully helps us to differentiate between people. Well, hey, instead of talking about the five factors, John, what are they? So on the left-hand side, you can see there's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And depending on how you want to arrange them, the acronym could either be ocean, as it is here, or canoe. So for example, if you want conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and then extroversion. So, openness. Openness is the tendency to appreciate new art, ideas, values, feelings, and behaviors. Conscientiousness is the tendency to be careful, you're on time for appointments, you're a rule follower, and you are hardworking. Extroversion looks at that tendency to be talkative, sociable, and to enjoy others. And it's the tendency as well to have a dominant personality style, or a dominant style of interaction with others. Agreeableness is the tendency to go along and to get along with others, rather than to assert one's own options and choices. And neuroticism is the tendency to frequently experience negative emotions, such as anger, worry, and sadness, as well as being interpersonally quite sensitive. Now, there is some really nice evidence that supports the big five, the five-factor model. So though there are some slight cultural variations, these same five factors have been found throughout all cultures in the world. So evidence exists from diverse cultures and diverse methods of reporting. So that's either from self-report or other report. The other thing too that's very interesting is that these traits are fairly stable over the lifespan, especially after the age of 30. Retest reliability after 6 years is 0.9, which is the same as it was after an interval of 2 weeks. So that is pretty nice. Or if you remember some of the critiques of the MBTI, where 5 weeks later 50% of people are reclassified into a different kind of grouping, this is really, really, really nice retest reliability, especially after a 6-year period, which is a fairly long time for follow-up. But here's something we found though for later in adulthood. We tend to find that as people age, they become less extroverted over time and less open to new experience. At the same time, they also become more self-confident and more emotionally stable with age. So we find this in different populations, but neuroticism as a whole tends to decrease with age, though extroversion and openness, and in some cases agreeableness, also tend to decrease a little bit. So what are some of the implications of the FFM traits? Well, traits can actually have significant implications for health and your overall life quality. So for example, we know that conscientiousness as a trait plays an important role in college and in your general life success, as well as in your health. So a study following a group of Harvard graduates found that conscientiousness was a significant predictor of several important life outcomes. Another study found that high extroversion, low neuroticism, and high openness was associated with higher longevity, which is about 2 to 3 years, independent of the effects of obesity or smoking. The same study found that neuroticism was a significant predictor for cardiovascular disease. Now, if we think about this, this makes sense, right? If you tend to experience a lot more negative emotions, it may actually indicate that perhaps you may experience more afflictions of various kinds, including mental health afflictions. At the same time, conscientiousness predicting important life outcomes like being healthy, being successful, it makes sense. If you are conscientious, on time, and a hard worker, it probably fits, doesn't it? So it's important then to know that personality traits are not just a useful way to describe people, but they actually help psychologists to predict behavior and functioning of particular people. So personality tests in and of themselves can be a very, very helpful thing for us to use in treatment and predictive things. There is also some value, I guess, in looking at the facets of particular traits. So we talk about kind of at the subtrait level, perhaps we'll see, if we slice personality a little bit, into the finer strips, perhaps we'll see better things. So for example, there's no really widely kind of accepted list of facets, because when you get to the facet level, you're really trying to take a very broad construct and make it even more specific. But so for example, if we take a look at agreeableness, I mean, we can look and see some of the facets of that might be that you're trusting, maybe you're straightforward, you're altruistic, you're compliant, you're modest, you're tender-minded. All of these facets would allow us, first of all, to have a better kind of description, to allow us to better predict specific behaviors. But one of the challenges that we find in psychology in general is that when we're moving into the subtrait level, both in personality testing as well as in other testing, in particular intelligence testing, is that things get a little bit more muddled. Really, the larger factors tend to predict a lot better than subtraits. And yet at the same time, there is value in better understanding subtraits, isn't there? Now, the Big Five is not without its critique, as any psychological theory is not. One would argue, and rightfully so, that it's not a complete picture of personality. So for example, it's not actually talking about traits that might be involved in mental disorders. So psychopathy, self-absorption, obsessional traits, all of these would be important to capture as part of personality. Because personality isn't just the good stuff, it's all the stuff. There's other important traits too. For example, what about religiosity, dishonesty, humor, independence, conventionality? All of these would be helpful traits for us to understand things. And yet at the same time, it's likely at the core of all personality variations. Now, there are other traits beyond the five-factor models. Some would suggest that there are more or fewer than five. We're going to talk about one that suggests this more in just a minute. But for example, Hans Eysenck, he suggested that extroversion and neuroticism are the most important, and they account for many of the differences in personality. So Eysenck actually had a three-factor model where he looked at personality. Regardless, it is important to note that five-factor is not the only kind of theory on the market, but it is right now one of the most popular and probably the one that has the largest research base. Enter the HEXACO model. So HEXACO is a revision of the five-factor model, and it's quite a nice little model. I like it because it adds in another dimension. It adds in this honesty, humility dimension as the sixth dimension of personality. So according to HEXACO, people that are high in this trait are sincere, fair, and modest, whereas those who are low in this trait are manipulative, narcissistic, and self-centered. So in HEXACO, we begin to see a slight move towards looking at measuring some of the psychopathology, or maybe some of the less adaptive behaviors, or less, I guess, socially acceptable behaviors. So there are still debates on the exact number and composition of traits and how important different ones are. Now, there is some evidence for HEXACO, and one is that it has better cross-cultural validity than the five-factor model. And we found out that this honesty-humility dimension has been found to predict dark triad antisocial beliefs. And so when we talk about the dark triad, we talk about things like narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So this is kind of an interesting finding, and especially in the forensic clinical world, perhaps a little bit more interesting and more helpful. It also seems to have greater theoretical coherence than a five-factor model because it appears to have two broad factors that characterize human living. So the willingness to work and explore, so things like extroversion, conscientiousness, and openness, and then the willingness to share with others and kin, which would look at that honesty, humility, emotionality, and agreeableness factors. Now, Walter Mischel in 1968 suggested that if we look at people's behavior across different situations, the consistency for us would be very unimpressive. And this is really at the heart of personality theory here, and the big questions about personality is the person-situation debate. It really pits the power of personality against the power of situational factors as determinants of behavior. So for example, are you a different person as a student compared to when you're a member of a close-knit social group? We know that people act differently in different situations. Why? Does that mean that their personality changes in these settings? No, it suggests that the situation has a power of its own to determine how we will act and respond. So Mischel thought that psychologists should focus more on our distinctive reactions to specific situations to better understand personality. He believed that these specific behaviors were driven by social cognitive processes, which would mean that interaction between psychologically meaningful features of the situation, a person's unique way of perceiving that situation, and their abilities for dealing with it. Now, most modern personality researchers will agree that there is a place for broad personality traits and for some of these narrower subunits. So, personality traits give us an indication about how people will act on average, but frequently they're not so good at predicting how a person will act in a specific situation at a specific moment in time, right? Because we're measuring a broad factor. We're not measuring a situation-specific factor. So to best capture broad traits, we've got to assess aggregate behaviors. We've got to average it over time, average over many different types of situations, and then we'll kind of have a general picture. So, but if we're wanting to move to the level of predicting specific behaviors in specific moments in time, then we have to look at either assessing personality on a situation-specific context, which I think is very tricky to do, or looking to see if perhaps there are meaningful subtraits that would be more helpful for predicting, or if there are other ways to clinically differentiate from these traits. Now, we're going to pause here and we will pick up on talking about personality assessment next.